The alarm on line 4 had been screaming for 11 minutes when Mason Brooks pushed his cleaning cart through the double doors, and nobody in the crowd of suits gathered around the control panel so much as glanced at him, because to them he was invisible, a gray uniform and a mop bucket. Background noise in a room where 6 figures were bleeding out by the minute. Scarlett Hayes stood at the center of that crowd, with her arms crossed so tightly against her chest that her knuckles had gone pale, watching a man in a $2,000 suit shake his head at a tablet full of diagnostics that meant nothing, and behind her, the giant readout on the wall kept climbing. $400,000, 410, 420, a number with teeth. Mason set his mop against the wall without a sound and walked toward the housing on the east side of the conveyor, crouched, and pressed 2 fingers flat against a bearing casing that nobody else had touched in 20 minutes of expert consultation. And when he stood back up, he said only 4 words, low, almost to himself. "It's not the motor." Scarlett turned on him like he'd fired a gun in a church, told him this was a restricted zone, told him his badge didn't clear him for anything past the yellow line, told him, loud enough that 3 consultants flinched, to get back to his cart before she had someone escort him out of the building for good. He didn't argue. He picked his cart back up, and as he pushed it toward the door, the last thing the room heard him say, quiet as ever, was that the seal on the number 6 coupling had been failing for about 6 weeks, and that whoever signed off on the last inspection report either hadn't looked or hadn't known what to look for. Then he was gone, and the alarm kept screaming, and nobody in that room understood yet that the man in the gray uniform had just handed them the answer and walked out the door with it. To find out how a night janitor ended up saving Hayes Industrial from a 9-figure contract collapse, and what it cost Scarlett Hayes to admit she'd been wrong about him from the very first day, stay until the very end. 3 years ago, none of this existed. Mason Brooks had a different name on his badge back then. Senior Design Engineer, a corner desk near the window, a wall of commendations he never bothered to hang. He'd spent 11 years designing conveyor and calibration systems for a mid-sized industrial contractor before Hayes Industrial acquired the division. And in the acquisition, half the engineering staff got folded into new departments and half got quietly let go. And Mason, through no decision of his own, ended up in the second half, a casualty of a merger memo nobody bothered to read carefully. That wasn't the part that broke him. His wife Elena had been sick for 14 months by then, a cancer that moved faster than any of the doctors expected. And Mason had spent those 14 months doing the math that every exhausted parent eventually does. Hours at the hospital against hours at the office, insurance premiums against savings. His daughter Ava's kindergarten drop-off against a 9 a.m. stand-up meeting he kept missing. When Elena died, he was 34 years old, with a 6-year-old daughter and a resume full of engineering credentials that suddenly felt like they belonged to a different man. He didn't apply for engineering jobs after that. Engineering jobs meant travel, meant unpredictable hours, meant late nights away from Ava when she was already losing too much. So instead, he took a maintenance position on the night shift at Hayes Industrial's flagship plant, 4 nights a week, home before Ava woke up, there for breakfast, there for the school bus, there in a way that mattered more to him than any title ever had. He never mentioned the engineering degree on the application. He never corrected anyone who assumed he'd always pushed a mop for a living. It was easier that way, and easier was what he needed. Scarlett Hayes had inherited the company from her father 2 years earlier, at 36, into a boardroom full of men who had watched her grow up, and still weren't sure she belonged at the head of the table. She ran the plant floor the way she ran everything else, with precision and distance, because distance was the only thing that had ever protected her from being underestimated the way her father had once been underestimated by his own board. The Meridian contract was the biggest deal Hayes Industrial had ever chased, an 18-month manufacturing partnership worth $210 million, contingent on a live production demonstration in front of Meridian's own delegation, scheduled for that very night. Everything Scarlett had spent 2 years building was riding on line 4, running clean for 40 minutes in front of people who were already skeptical that a woman in her 30s could hold a company like this together. When the line went down 19 minutes before the delegation was due to arrive, She brought in the three most expensive systems consultants in the state. Men whose names appeared in trade journals. Men who charged more per hour than most of her floor staff made in a week. And none of them could find the fault. That was the room Mason Brooks walked into with his mop bucket. That was the room he walked back out of 4 words later, carrying the truth about the number 6 coupling Cecil with him, unheard, unthanked, and about to become the most important employee Hayes Industrial didn't know it had. The consultants kept working the motor housing for another 11 minutes after Mason left, running the same diagnostics a second time, a third time, getting the same blank results, while the countdown clock on the wall ticked toward the delegation's arrival. And Scarlett felt the deal, and 2 years of her life, sliding out of her hands in real time. It was her assistant, a sharp, quietly observant young woman named Priya Anand, who first said out loud what none of the executives wanted to hear, that the janitor had said something specific, something about a coupling seal, and that maybe, with 11 minutes left and nothing else working, it was worth 5 minutes to check. Scarlett didn't answer right away. She had built her entire professional identity around trusting expertise, credentials, the people who were supposed to know, and the idea of trusting the man she'd just threatened to have removed from the building felt, in that moment, like admitting a kind of failure she wasn't ready to name. But the clock kept moving, and the alternative was watching the Meridian delegation walk onto a silent factory floor. So she told Priya to find him. Find the janitor. Bring him back. 8 months would pass before Scarlett Hayes would understand that the 5 minutes it took to find Mason Brooks that night were the 5 minutes that saved her company, and the moment that started unraveling everything she thought she knew about the people she'd spent her whole career walking past. Priya found Mason in the east stairwell, already 3 flights down, already halfway out of the building the way he always was after his cart was put away, and his shift technically ended. And when she told him Miss Hayes wanted him back on the floor, he didn't move right away. He asked quietly whether Ms. Hayes wanted him back to fix the line or back to be told again that he didn't belong there. Priya didn't have an answer for that, so she just asked him to come. And because Ava was waiting for him at home and every minute mattered to her too, he came, not for Scarlett Hayes, not for the company, but because leaving something broken when he knew how to fix it had never once in his life felt like an option. Back on the floor, with 9 minutes left before the Meridian delegation's cars would be pulling into the executive lot, Mason walked straight to the number 6 coupling without asking anyone's permission this time, pulled the housing panel with a screwdriver he kept clipped inside his cart for exactly this kind of unofficial repair, and showed the room a seal that had cracked clean through, a $2 part sitting inside a $200 million problem. He didn't have a replacement seal in his cart, but he had, from years of habit, a temporary compression fix he'd used a dozen times on smaller equipment, a fix that would hold for the length of a 40-minute demonstration and not 1 minute longer. He asked for 4 minutes and a torque wrench. Scarlett, watching a night janitor disassemble the failure point that 3 specialists in tailored suits had failed to find in 20, said nothing, just nodded and stepped back. Line 4 came back online with 90 seconds to spare. The Meridian delegation walked onto a factory floor that hummed exactly the way it was supposed to hum, watched 40 minutes of flawless output, and signed a letter of intent before they left the building that night. It should have been, by any measure, the best night of Scarlett Hayes' professional life, and for about 11 minutes, standing in the afterglow of the delegation's departure, it was. Then one of the senior consultants, a man named Dale Whitfield, who had built a career out of never being wrong in front of a client, pulled her aside and reframed the entire night in a way that made her blood run cold before she'd even fully processed it. Whitfield told her that what had just happened was a serious liability. An unauthorized maintenance worker performing an unsanctioned repair on live production equipment during a client demonstration, a repair that hadn't gone through engineering sign-off, hadn't been documented, hadn't been cleared by anyone with the authority to approve it. If that temporary seal had failed mid-demonstration, he told her, if Mason Brooks's fix had blown out in front of Meridian's own engineers instead of holding, the company wouldn't just have lost the contract, It could have faced real legal exposure for letting an uncertified employee gamble with a client's confidence like that. Whitfield's tone was calm, reasonable, corporate, the tone of a man who had spent his career making dangerous ideas sound like sober risk management. And Scarlett, exhausted and still running on adrenaline, let his framing settle into her the way water settles into a crack. She called Mason into her office the next morning, not to thank him, but to tell him, in the flattest voice she owned, that what he'd done the night before, however well-intentioned, could not happen again. She told him maintenance staff were not authorized to perform engineering-level repairs on production equipment, that his actions had exposed the company to liability it couldn't afford, and that going forward he was to report any equipment failures to his supervisor and nothing more. She did not ask him how he'd known what was wrong with the coupling in 4 seconds when 3 consultants had missed it in 20 minutes. She did not ask him where a night janitor had learned to read a bearing housing like a man who'd spent a career doing exactly that. She had built a wall around herself made entirely out of never being the one caught unprepared, and admitting there was something about Mason Brooks she didn't understand felt, in that sealed and airless office, more dangerous than simply telling him to stay in his lane. Mason listened to all of it without a flicker of protest crossing his face, said only that he understood, and left her office the same quiet way he'd left the factory floor the night before. What she didn't see, because she wasn't looking for it, was the small folded index card he carried in his shirt pocket every single shift, a card with 2 rows of numbers on it, Ava's school pickup times and the phone number for her after-school program, a reminder of exactly why he had chosen, 3 years ago, to never again let a job be bigger than his daughter's need for him to come home. 2 weeks later, the company's official incident report on the Line 4 repair was finalized, and it credited the engineering consultation team with identifying and resolving the coupling failure, with a footnote acknowledging supplemental floor support from maintenance staff, no name attached. Mason never saw the report. He wasn't in a position to see reports like that. He emptied trash cans in the hallway where they were filed. Dale Whitfield, meanwhile, quietly recommended to 2 other board members that maintenance staff be issued clearer boundaries around equipment access going forward, framing it as a liability safeguard. And nobody thought to ask why the man most responsible for that recommendation had also been the man most humiliated by being outperformed by a janitor in front of a major client. Mason kept working his 4 nights a week, kept mopping the same floors, kept his index card in his shirt pocket, and told no one, not even Priya, who had started nodding to him in the hallway now, anything about the 11 years he'd spent designing the exact kind of systems he'd fixed that night in 4 minutes. He assumed, the way he'd assumed for 3 years, that this was simply how his life worked now, invisible and useful and unclaimed. He had no way of knowing that 6 floors above him, a woman who had just told him to stay in his lane was already lying awake some nights, replaying the sight of his hands on that housing panel, wondering why a maintenance worker's fingers had moved with the certainty of someone who'd built the machine himself. 1 month later, an ordinary Thursday afternoon would change everything neither of them had said out loud yet. The unraveling started small, the way these things usually do, with a single line item Scarlett noticed while reviewing quarterly maintenance logs she normally never read personally. A work order from 4 years earlier, filed under a different division before the acquisition, listed a M. Brooks as the lead design engineer on a calibration system nearly identical in architecture to the Line 4 coupling assembly, the same manufacturer, the same generation of housing, the same failure points. She told herself it had to be a coincidence, a common enough surname, and moved on to the next log. But the thought stayed lodged in her the way a splinter stays lodged under skin, invisible until you press on it. She mentioned it to Priya almost in passing, half hoping to be told she was imagining a connection that wasn't there. And Priya, who had a talent for noticing exactly the things people hoped wouldn't be noticed, pulled the old personnel records from the acquisition archive that same afternoon without being asked twice. It took her under an hour to find the file. Mason Brooks, senior design engineer, 11 years of service, 17 commendations, a transfer date that lined up precisely with the merger, and a termination that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with a department restructuring memo that someone, years ago, had signed without ever meeting the man whose career it ended. Scarlett sat with that file open on her desk for a long time before she did anything with it, because the version of herself that made sense of the world through competence and control did not know what to do with the version of events where she had spent 2 months, treating a decorated senior engineer like a liability for solving in 4 minutes a problem her 3 highest-paid consultants couldn't solve at all. She thought about the index card in his pocket, which she had noticed once without understanding it, a small folded thing he touched sometimes like a man checking a compass. She thought about how carefully he had spoken to her that morning, in her office. No defensiveness, no attempt to correct her, just quiet acceptance of a reprimand he had every right to challenge and chose not to. It occurred to her, sitting there, that a man capable of designing the systems her company depended on had also been capable, this entire time, of simply telling her who he was, and had chosen silence instead, and she didn't yet understand why. Only that the reason mattered more than she'd been willing to admit. The secondary crisis arrived before she'd worked up the nerve to act on any of it. Dale Whitfield, sensing that his earlier framing of the coupling incident was beginning to lose its footing, as questions circulated about who had actually solved the Line 4 failure, moved to protect himself the only way he knew how, by escalating. He drafted a formal complaint alleging that Mason had violated safety protocol during the repair, citing the temporary compression fix as evidence of reckless disregard for procedure, and recommended Mason's termination before the matter could, in Whitfield's words, become a liability precedent for the company. He brought the complaint directly to 2 board members before Scarlett even knew it existed, framing it as protecting the company from the very praise that was starting to surface around the janitor's name. When Scarlett found out, 2 days later, that a termination recommendation for Mason Brooks was already sitting in front of her board, she understood with sudden, uncomfortable clarity that she was not the only person in the building who had noticed something didn't add up about that night on Line 4, and that Whitfield's motive for silencing the story had nothing to do with liability, and everything to do with a man who couldn't stomach being outperformed by someone he'd been trained to overlook. She went to Mason's shift that same night, not in her office, not summoning him through Priya, but walking down to the maintenance corridor herself for the first time in 2 years running the company, and found him restocking a supply closet near Line 4 with the same unhurried care he brought to everything. She told him what she'd found in the archive. She told him about Whitfield's complaint. She told him, in a voice that cracked slightly in a way she hated herself for, that she was sorry, that she should have asked him questions instead of giving him warnings, that she'd let a room full of expensive men convince her a mop and a badge meant a person had nothing left to teach her. Then she offered him what she assumed any reasonable person would want: his old title back, full engineering salary, backdated seniority, an office with a window. Mason listened to all of it the way he listened to everything, still and attentive, and when she finished, he told her plainly that he didn't want the office or the title, that what he wanted was for her to understand why he'd said nothing for 3 years. And it wasn't pride, and it wasn't fear of her specifically. It was that engineering jobs meant travel and late nights and unpredictable hours, and his daughter Ava had already lost her mother, and he had promised himself the day Elena died that he would never again let ambition cost his daughter a single dinner she needed him at the table for. Scarlett stood in that supply closet corridor and felt something shift in her that had nothing to do with contracts or board approval, something she didn't have a name for yet. And it was in that unremarkable hallway under fluorescent light that the real story between them actually began. 8 months would pass before that quiet conversation in the supply closet corridor would grow into something neither of them had expected, and before Dale Whitfield's complaint would come back to unravel far more than he'd ever intended. Scarlett killed the termination complaint the next morning, in front of the same 2 board members Whitfield had gone to behind her back, laying out the archive file, the acquisition records, and the discrepancy between what the official incident report credited and what the security footage from that night actually showed. She'd had Priya pull the full, unedited footage, and it told a story with no ambiguity left in it at all. 3 consultants standing motionless around a diagnostic tablet for 22 minutes. And 1 maintenance worker identifying the failure point in under 10 seconds without touching a single piece of equipment first, just looking, the way a man looks at something he built with his own hands. Whitfield, cornered in front of the board with footage he couldn't argue with, and a personnel file he hadn't known existed, tried first to reframe his complaint as concern for procedure, then to suggest the footage had been selectively presented, and finally, when neither argument held, fell into a silence of his own, the specific, brittle silence of a man watching a version of events he'd spent weeks constructing collapse in real time. The board didn't fire him that day, but they stripped him of oversight on the maintenance division and made it clear, in the particular bloodless language board's use, that his judgment on this matter would not be trusted again. What happened over the following months mattered more to Mason than any of that boardroom vindication, because it happened on the factory floor, where the people who actually worked alongside him got to see, for the first time, what he could do when nobody told him to stop. Scarlett didn't reinstate him to a corner office. She'd listened, finally, to what he'd actually asked for, which was smaller and stranger and more meaningful than any title. He wanted a standing consulting arrangement, 4 nights a week, the same hours he already worked, the same closeness to Ava's school schedule he'd built his whole life around, but with authority to flag and address engineering-level issues before they became $600,000 emergencies, and with his name, finally, on the reports. Over the following weeks, working exactly those hours, Mason recalibrated the tolerance settings on 3 aging conveyor systems that had been operating on margins so tight the whole plant had simply learned to live with the risk, replaced a batch of coupling seals across 2 other lines before they could fail the way the Line 4 seal had failed, and rewrote the plant's entire preventive maintenance schedule using a level of specificity, bearing wear curves, seal degradation rates under the plant's actual humidity and load conditions, coupling torque specifications down to the Newton meter. That made it obvious to every engineer who read it that whoever wrote it had spent a career doing exactly this kind of work at the highest level. The consultants Hayes Industrial had once paid a fortune to were quietly not renewed the following quarter. It was during those weeks, away from boardrooms and incident reports, that Scarlett actually got to know Mason, not as a discovery or a correction of her own mistake, but as a person. She started staying later some nights, not to check on the line, but because she found herself wanting to hear what he thought about a torque spec or a scheduling change. And those conversations, low-voiced and unhurried in an empty plant at 11 at night, kept drifting somewhere warmer than either of them had planned for. He mentioned Ava more, small things, a school project on bridges that had lit up her whole week, a birthday coming up that he was quietly stressed about affording the way he wanted to. Scarlett, who had built her adult life around never letting anyone see the parts of her that weren't fully in control, found herself telling him things she hadn't told her own board, about the loneliness of running a company everyone assumed she'd inherited rather than earned, about the exhausting, grinding cost of proving herself over and over to men who'd known her since she was a child in her father's office. One evening she stayed past midnight, helping him fold laundry over video call, because Ava had a stomach bug and he couldn't leave. And somewhere in the middle of that ordinary, unglamorous hour, Scarlett Hayes understood that she had fallen for a man she'd once threatened to have removed from her own building, and that the falling had nothing to do with what he'd fixed on Line 4 and everything to do with who he'd chosen to be every single day since. Word of what Mason had done, the real story, not the sanitized incident report, had by then spread through the plant floor the way true things eventually do, whispered between shifts, confirmed by workers who'd seen the unedited footage Priya had quietly shared with a few trusted colleagues, and it reached, eventually, a version of the story that made its way to a local business journalist covering the Meridian Contracts public announcement. The journalist wanted an interview, wanted the human angle, the janitor who'd saved a $200 million deal, and Scarlett, faced with a choice between a story that made her look decisive for recognizing his value, or a story that made her look exactly as blind as she'd actually been, chose, For the first time in her career, the version that told the truth even at her own expense. 1 month later, the day of the public contract signing ceremony, would bring that truth in front of more witnesses than either of them had expected, and would ask Scarlett Hayes to prove, in the most public moment of her professional life, that she meant every word of what she'd started to feel. The signing ceremony for the finalized Meridian partnership was held on the factory floor itself, in front of Line 4, at Scarlett's insistence, with the full leadership of both companies present, along with the plant staff, who almost never got invited to occasions like this. Scarlett stood at the podium with the finalized contract behind her, and, before a single word about revenue projections or partnership terms, she told the room the true story of what had happened on that floor 8 months earlier, without softening it, without protecting her own image inside it. She told them a consulting team had failed for 22 minutes to find a problem that Mason Brooks, a maintenance technician and former senior design engineer, had identified in under 10 seconds, and that she had responded to that gift by threatening to have him removed from the building. She told them about the archive file, about the merger that had erased his title without ever meeting him, about the 3 years he'd spent invisible in his own company by choice, protecting a daughter who had already lost her mother, because he had decided nothing mattered more than being present for her. Then she asked Mason, who was standing near the back beside his cart out of old habit, to come forward, not to accept an award, not for applause, but so that the people who had walked past him for 3 years could finally know exactly who they had been walking past. The applause that followed was long and unplanned and slightly chaotic. Workers from 3 different shifts on their feet, and in the middle of it, Scarlett offered him, in front of everyone, the largest gesture the company had available. Full reinstatement as Director of Engineering, a corner office, a public title befitting the public credit. Mason let the applause settle before he answered, the way he let everything settle before he spoke, and then he declined it, gently, the same way he declined it in the supply closet corridor months earlier, and asked instead for something smaller and stranger to the executives in the room, but exactly right to everyone who'd ever felt unseen in a building like this one. A formal review process, written into company policy, requiring that every major equipment failure investigation include direct consultation with the maintenance staff who worked the floor every day before any consultant ever touched a diagnostic tablet. He asked that it be named nothing, attached to no plaque, just quietly built into how the company operated from then on, so that the next person like him, invisible in a gray uniform with a mop bucket, would never again be told to stay behind the yellow line while the real answer walked out the door. The quiet coda came 5 months later, on an ordinary Saturday afternoon in autumn, at a small house with a swing set in the backyard and a maple tree just starting to turn. Mason and Scarlett had married that spring, in a small ceremony that Ava, now 9, had insisted on planning the seating chart for, and on this particular afternoon Scarlett sat on the back porch step grading nothing, checking no emails, simply watching Ava explain to her father, with the total seriousness only a 9-year-old can bring to a school project, how the suspension bridge she'd built out of popsicle sticks was going to hold the weight of 3 textbooks without collapsing. Mason knelt beside her, quiet the way he always was, pointing at one joint in the popsicle stick truss and asking her, not telling her, what she thought might happen there under load. And Scarlett watched him teach his daughter the exact kind of patient, precise attention he'd once used to save a company he didn't even work for anymore. In title, though of course, in every way that mattered, he did. On the porch railing beside her sat the old folded index card, retired now from his shirt pocket, framed under glass as a gift Scarlett had made for him the day the new maintenance policy was signed into the company handbook. No longer a reminder of what he might lose, but a record of what he'd never once let go. If there is one thing this story asks you to sit with, it is this. The people you walk past every day, the ones in uniforms nobody looks twice at, the ones who go quiet instead of loud when they're underestimated, are so often carrying more skill, more history, and more quiet strength than any title could ever announce. Worth was never supposed to depend on who notices it. Mason Brooks spent 3 years invisible by choice, not because he had nothing to offer, but because he had already decided what mattered most, and he never once asked anyone to see him for it. Somewhere in your own life, in your own version of that factory floor, There is probably someone like him, and maybe, if this story did anything at all today, it's made you a little more likely to look twice before you decide who has nothing left to teach you. If you want to see the exact moment Scarlett finally showed Mason the security footage from that very first night, and the words she said to him when she realized the truth, stay for the final scene.